The next set of video notes that you're going to do is going to focus on amphibians. So we've talked about fish. Now we're moving forward into amphibians, which are the closest land relatives to fish. So there's two terms you need to be familiar with. First is tetrapods. So tetra meaning four, podos meaning foot. This is only used to describe living tetrapods and recent common ancestors. So this term is good for amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and their common ancestor. The other term we're going to talk about is amphibia. This just means double life, and if you know anything about amphibians, you know that they either move back and forth between land and water, or they spend one stage of their life on land and one stage on water. So before we get into the details of amphibians, we're going to talk a little bit about their ancestors. So the stegocephalian taxa is what is typically referred to as the extinct tetrapod ancestors. The best known one of these is Ichthyostega. So it was not the first amphibian, but it did exist around 400 million years ago, and it's a really good representative because it has a lot of the features that you see in modern amphibians. So here's some of those features. First of all, there's reduced cranial bones. As you know, frogs, toads, when you think about those types of animals, they really don't have much of a neck bone. They do have mobile necks though, and they don't have opercular bones, so that operculum in fish would protect the gills. They don't have those anymore. There was also a ridged vertebral column. They had four limbs, which is the key feature of amphibians, and the loss of the rays, and then also that fusing of the vertebrae, which we'll get into more. So how did we get all these species? Well, a common concept called adaptive radiation is basically how one species eventually evolves into many, many different species. So at one time, there were many species of tetrapods, which were from this common ancestor, but they are now extinct, which makes tracing the ancestry a little difficult. So they're still thought to be closely related to modern tetrapods and amniotes, and a quick refresher there too is amniotes is just the amniotic egg. So reptiles, birds, and mammals have this kind of egg because they live their lives completely on land. Amphibians have not reached this point yet because they still live in the water as well. So here's just a possible cladogram. Now let's get into today. So amphibians today live on all continents except Antarctica, and there are absent though from many oceanic islands. There are 6,000 living species today, which doesn't really seem like that much. It's actually very few compared to what once existed. And you can look at this key down here that shows you the different continents and countries and how many different species there are there. Obviously, like here is our rainforest, and that's where most of the species are. So when we look at living amphibians, so they are in class Amphibia here, but they're separated into three major orders. So we're going to talk about each of these orders as we progress. So class Amphibia, there's some general characteristics that they all have in common. First of all, their skin. They don't have scales or hair, so they have mucus secretions. All amphibians have this. Their larvae, or their young, are usually aquatic, which is where that water connection is, and they undergo some form of metamorphosis to become an adult. They have a three-chambered heart, which is different from the fish, which had two, and they have that one cervical vertebrae and one sacral vertebrae. And just some examples: salamanders, newts, frogs, toads, and caecilians. So let's get into our first order. So order Caudata. These are your salamanders and newts. They are a little bit different than frogs because they keep their tail throughout life. They never lose their tail. They have unspecialized legs, and they don't have that middle ear either. There are 400 species, mostly in the northern hemisphere, and some are terrestrial, but remember, they have to have water. So they live on moist forest floors, and their larvae are still aquatic. Some of them also live in caves, and just kind of a fun fact, the largest North American salamander is the hellbender. They also do internal fertilization, so they don't actually mate, so copulation, they're not actually mating. The males are going to deposit sperm, and the females pick it up and put it in their cloaca where it gets stored. So kind of an interesting concept compared to what we've talked about so far with different animals. The eggs are then fertilized while they're in the cloaca, and these larvae are very similar in appearance to the adults, except they have external gills like you see over here, a tail fin, and a rudimentary tongue. So let's talk a little bit more about the life cycle. So most salamanders are going to go through something called metamorphosis. Now, we start here with our eggs. You see the larva, you see the maturing larva, and those legs start to appear, but they never lose the tail. And then as we get to an adult, they still have that tail, and those external lungs are going to disappear. Now there are very extremes in this order as well. So there's the Plethodontidae and the Salamandriae. Now the ones that are the Plethodontidae are fully terrestrial, most of them. The eggs are laid on moist land and the young are just miniatures. The Salamandridae are things called newts, and they actually spend most of their life in water, and they actually frequently keep their caudal fins as well. Some of them also go through incomplete metamorphosis, and this is when you're going to hear a term called paedomorphic or neotenic, which means they become sexually mature, but they still have larval characteristics. So for example, a mud puppy, which you'll see in these pictures, they still have those external gills that are typically only found in the larva, but they are adults. The next order is Gymnophiona, and this is also sometimes referred to as Apoda. Now, this name itself means gymnos, naked, and like a snake, ophinios. So Apoda themselves, then they don't have feet. So caecilians are a common species here, and there's 160 of them, and they typically live in tropical locations. They do burrow like worms, and they actually look segmented because of skin folds they have over their muscles. It's also important to note that they use chemoreception, and they do this with a tentacle that's actually between their eyes. They do also have skin over their eyes, so they're almost blind, so they rely on their other senses. They do have internal fertilization, once again. Some of them will give birth to live young, though, and some will lay eggs. The next and final order we're going to talk about is order Anura, or Salientia. These are our frogs and toads. So A meaning without, aura meaning tail, so without a tail. There are 4,000 species of frogs and toads, and the distinction between the two is mostly perception. So there's some key features you can look at below. So frogs, smooth, wet skin, toads, dry, warty. Frogs have teeny tiny teeth. Toads, they don't have teeth. And frogs are going to jump or leap. Toads can still kind of hop. They don't actually jump as high as frogs can. And the way they lay their eggs is also really, really different in that frogs lay eggs in like clumps or large masses, and toads lay them in kind of long parallel strings. So when we talk about frogs and toads, they're mostly in moist environments, and some islands and high latitudes, that's not the case, but some of them can actually even live in deserts, which is kind of crazy. They don't have a tail like we talked about, but they have something called a urostyle, which is those caudal vertebrae that are fused. They have long muscular hind limbs, webbed feet, and they usually do external fertilization. So this is the first order within the amphibians that does external fertilization. They also have tadpoles, and those are just their aquatic larvae, and they end up getting their limbs, but remember, if you think about a tadpole, they have long tails, no feet or legs. They get those limbs at the end of being a larva. So let's talk about the double life. So on land, they have bones to support their body, and they can go do gas exchange with the air. But in the water, they're supported by the buoyancy of their body, and actually their skin allows for gas exchange with the water. So they can actually breathe both underwater and above water. Let's get into now some external structures. So we already talked about the mucus-covered skin. This protects from tons of things, so microorganisms, UV, desiccation, mechanical injury. Their skin is very important to their survival. Their skin also allows for gas exchange, regulation of temperature, and the absorption and storage of water. So the skin of amphibians is essential to their survival. It keeps them moist, it aids in mating, it can produce toxins, even change color. Sometimes there's things like bumps and claws and warts and sandpaper texture, but they stay safe all without feathers or hair. And how do they do this? With glands. So the water is also going to support the aquatic species of amphibians. Terrestrial species do have skeletons, and that helps with the muscle attachment and support against gravity. If you remember here, we talked about fish and their gills and them suffocating, because when they get out of water, their gills collapse and they can't breathe. So amphibians have evolved for survival with gravity out of the water. So they do have some modifications as well. So a smaller, flatter skull, make the skeleton lighter than a fish, and they also have jaws for crushing, and that flexible vertebral column which supports and suspends the weight between the limbs, kind of like a bridge. So fish only kind of move one way, whereas amphibians have that better skeleton overall. Some other terms is the zygapophyses. These are extensions of the vertebrae that just help prevent twisting of the backbone. Cervical vertebrae allow knotting, and the sacral vertebrae attaches to the pelvic griddle for extra support for the vertebrae. And this picture itself shows the urostyle, which we had mentioned earlier, which is those fused caudal vertebrae. And the sternum themselves, some of them do have a sternum for forelimb attachment, but it's important to note that it's reduced or absent in Anura, which is the frogs and toads. So their appendages have a similar structure to early fish, so homologous type structures. However, amphibians have joints, and those joints allow for much more movement than a fish. They also have a pelvic girdle, which is really important for living on land. They do have a reduced body wall, so they use their appendages for motion and not the body wall like a fish, if you remember all the muscles that fish have. So this has reduced muscles and increased musculature in their appendicular areas. So think about it. When we eat fish, right, we eat the body of the fish. When we eat frogs, we're not eating any part of their body except their legs, which is where all their muscles are for movement. So salamanders do, though, move very similar to a fish. So they're going to move kind of in a wave-like motion as they walk, and you can pause this here and examine this picture. Caecilians then also move in an accordion-like movement, and remember, they have those segments. So those segments, or segment-like folds, I should say, are going to help them move in that accordion way. Anura then, on the other hand, remember, they're jumping. So they have lots of key features and adaptations that help them with jumping. So let's talk about the nutrition and digestion. So adults in general are mostly carnivorous. They feed on invertebrates. Bullfrogs, though, can eat much bigger things because they're a lot larger. They do hunt by sight, so they just simply wait for the prey to pass. And salamanders and caecilians actually use olfactory senses to help catch prey. The larvae, on the other hand, though, are mostly herbivores, so they kind of change their eating habits as they mature. Salamanders, it's important to note, have unspecialized jaws, while anurans and some salamanders can use their tongue to kind of flip and grab, so that helps. The first animal, though, it's only the first animal with a true tongue. Fish really didn't have a tongue. It's kind of a fold. We call it a tongue. But amphibians have that true tongue. And they also have mucus, which helps capture the prey. It's pressed against the roof of the mouth, and then it's moved down their throat. So circulation, they also have a dual circulation system. So they can use their lungs for breathing on land, but they can also breathe through their skin. And this is really, really valuable for amphibians, especially that hibernate in the winter in the bottom of a pond. It is easier for them to breathe on land than in the water, but they can still do both. So cutaneous respiration is across the skin. This can be 30 to 90% of gas exchange on water and land, but they can also do bucopharyngeal respiration, which is across the surface of the mouth and the pharynx, and this is only 1 to 7%. And they do have something called a buccal pump then that forces the air into the lungs. It's also important to note that amphibians are ectothermic, so they do rely on that external heat source, and that's also why they hibernate in the winter. When in the water, they take the temperature on the water, and then of course on land it varies depending on which environment they're in. They can regulate through their behavior as well, so they can go in a cool area if they're warm or sit on a warm surface if they're cold, but they do have a very wide tolerance because of the environments they live in. Their nervous and sensory functions are very similar to other vertebrates, so they have those 3 major brain parts, a forebrain, a midbrain, and a hindbrain, and we're getting very, very specialized with the brain of amphibians versus fish. They also have many sensory receptors, so they have lots and lots of nerve endings on their skin. They can sense heat, cold, pain. They also have chemoreceptors, which is in their nose and the lining of their mouth and their tongue, which is used to find mates, find food, and detect toxic chemicals. Their eyes are also one of the most important sense structures they have. So as we mentioned, they are sight feeders. They catch the prey by watching it. And they have forward-facing eyes, which is binocular vision, and this is really important for depth perception. They have a movable lower eyelid, which cleans and protects the eye. It's made of something called the nictitating membrane. So this covers the cornea when the eye is retracted, and it also helps clean. They have orbital glands to lubricate and wash the eye. They have a lens, an iris, rods and cones. This really, really helps them have that really great vision to catch their prey. Their auditory system is also adapted for life on land, so they can transmit vibrations on land, and their ears contain a middle ear and an inner ear and something called a tympanic membrane, which is stretched over their ear, which you will see in live frogs or in our dissection. The muscles then also allow them to be locked and filter out high or low frequency sounds, and these are important for different reasons. High is for mating, but low frequency is for predators. Salamanders do lack this tympanic membrane in middle ear, so they only hear low frequency.